Mum, where did I come from? It's an innocent enough question, but one that's not always easy to answer. And even once you've dealt with the delicate realities of basic biology, the question goes deeper into issues of identity and destiny. Because the view we have of our origins, of the source of life, the universe, and everything, as the classic quote goes, has implications for how we see our value as human beings and whether we have any sense of hope for the future.
This is Signs of the Times Radio with Kent Kingston.
Hi, welcome to Science Radio for another week. I'm on the phone with Lindell Peterson from Melbourne. She's a church leader there for the Seventh-day Adventist Church. She's written a fantastic article for us in the August edition of Signs of the Times magazine. How are you doing, Lindell?
I'm good, Kent. I'm in the office at the moment, but have been working from home for the last couple of months because it's a little crazy in Victoria at the moment, but otherwise keeping well.
Yeah, well, I can imagine it has been pretty crazy, and I certainly would like to ask you, a little bit about that and the implications of that. But can you just tell us briefly what's the vibe? You know, this has been going on for several weeks now in Victoria. Are people worried? Is there a sort of a sense of tension in the air for you guys?
Look, it is a really strange situation. I mean, we've entered into stage 4 lockdown, which has a curfew. So in the evenings, it's a lot quieter. You know, if you were to stick your head out the window, you can hear birds rather than cars on the street. So in that sense, there's this sort of eerie kind of calm that's come over the city a bit. But I think there is a sense of uncertainty. As you're probably aware, the cases are growing day by day in the 3 figures, and it's a bit nerve-wracking because each time you go out, you look at how many cases are in your area and you think, could this be the day?
Yeah. They say the worst fear of all is the fear of the unknown, and I guess that's exactly where you guys are at. You know, it's you just don't know where this is going to go. So I can certainly understand the sense of nerves there. Now, you've written a really interesting article for us in the August magazine, Lindell, the August Signs of the Times. It's entitled "In the Beginning," and you focus on origin stories. This is sort of ironic, sadly, to a certain point, because obviously, this month, August, where there were a number of movies that were due to come out in the cinema that's now been delayed and pushed back. And I think one of the movies that was due to come out was a Marvel movie, and they're big on origin stories, of course. You know, the superhero origin stories. Where do they come from? What's their backstory? And I think the Black Widow origin story, origin movie from Marvel, what was coming out, Natasha Romanoff, all that stuff. There's actually a mention of it in another article. It's a bit of a theme in the August Signs of the Times, which is interesting. But why do you think people are so fascinated by origin stories of superheroes? I mean, they love to see the action and the explosions and the chases and the superpowers at work, but it seems people have this desire to sort of get back to the beginning and find out, how did these superheroes, become what they became?
Yeah, I think you're right. I find origin stories absolutely fascinating, but I'll be honest with you, I am not a big superhero movie fan. When I wrote this article, I actually had to call on a few friends who are really into this sort of stuff and ask them for some references because it's not really my theme. But yep. I resonate with the whole concept of origin stories. That's what really fascinates me.
Yeah.
I think the reason that superhero origin stories are so popular at the moment is because we've seen a resurgence in these sort of superhero movies, and they almost have a cult following where people, they've seen stories like, they've read the comic books as kids or teenagers, and now they're getting to my age, maybe in their 30s.
Yeah.
And they're going, Marvel's really tapping into this and saying, well, how did this all come about? Where did they come from? What makes Spider-Man the way he is, or what makes, like you said, the Black Widow, where does she come from? How does she how does that all start, and what's around this? And I think the reason we're fascinated by this is because it brings superheroes down to almost a human level. And it gives us it taps into this idea that perhaps if they originated in a similar way to what I did, they were just a kid in a school, I was just a kid in a school, they grew up in a small town, I grew up in a small town. It helps us to relate to them on a really level, and it places their story in context, and it helps us, I think, make sense of our story in context.
Yeah.
So I think there's elements of like hope, there's elements of excitement and success through adversity, I should say. So this idea of, well, if someone else can experience a traumatic upbringing or a challenge in their life and come out and make something positive out of that, then I guess there's hope for me as well. And I think that's what really gets us excited about these origin type stories.
Yeah.
For me, I think origins of like the underdog story that comes from starting like a big business or a company are just as fascinating, because again, it tells us that regular people are doing incredible things, and we all start from very similar places. We all start from, a mother and a father, or we all start from a small town or a school, or we can relate to all these different beginnings.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting too, isn't it, Lindell, that people are not only fascinated by the superheroes and the success stories, like you say, those businesses that, maybe, I guess, the classic example of, started in a garage somewhere in California and is now one of the biggest companies in Silicon Valley. That's the sort of, thing we like to hear about. Yeah. But it's also interesting that people are really interested in the villains too. Like when it comes to movies, often these days it seems the villain has a backstory too, and you can see how they were, persecuted as a child in some way, or they had some, abusive upbringing or something, and we're sort of encouraged to understand, how someone might have become this way, or the obsession that people have with true crime, and you think, why would you, try to get yourself in the head of a serial killer or whatever, but people do. They're fascinated. They want to understand, like, what is going on.
Exactly. And I think you've highlighted something there, because we're fascinated by, look at Netflix at the moment is full of all these true stories about, serial killers or people that have done horrific things, or even the Harvey Weinstein, am I saying the right one?
Yeah.
I get the name. Yeah, that whole scandal at the moment, and the origins of these scandals and crimes, because we know what went wrong. Because the reality is we're all born as crying naked babies, into this world.
Yep.
And something somewhere along the line changes, where we either become triumphant out of adversity, or that adversity leads us to a really dark place. And so origin stories, I think, are incredibly important, because they show us that while we all have very similar beginnings, things can go very differently. And it helps us to understand and put other people's stories in context as well. We're fascinated by behavior of other people, and finding out what happened early in their life can often help us almost compartmentalize and make sense of some of the things that go on in this world. Yeah, it's fascinating.
Yeah. You do something really interesting in your article, Lindell, because you make that connection with, fictional origin stories, or, sort of business startup sort of origin stories. But then you sort of flip it around a bit, and you point out that when it comes to the way we see ourselves and the way we understand ourselves, we also create origin stories about ourselves. You know what I mean? We're kind of selective, I guess, in the narrative that we tell about ourselves, about, our upbringing, what sort of person we are, what our influences were, what those crucial sort of turning points were for us. That's interesting, isn't it? Our self-concept sort of depends on this story that we tell about ourselves.
And I think that comes about because each one of us, and I don't think it's just a young person thing. I think whatever age, whatever demographic, each one of us really wants to just make sense of where we fit in the world and why we are the way that we are. So looking at our origins and looking at what's happened in our life helps us to fit ourselves into that puzzle piece, and of the broader concept of who am I and how do I exist in this world. And I made reference to a psychologist in there who talks about this kind of phenomenon in the superhero sort of industry,
Yeah.
I could probably say. And she talks about the key elements that we relate to is this idea of every superhero undergoes trauma, destiny, or sheer chance. And I think that's why we resonate with these origin stories and these superheroes, because we go, is there a moment in my life where I've experienced trauma that's altered me? Is there a moment in my life where I've experienced what we call destiny? Or is there a chance moment that has shaped who I am and been a turning point in my life? Because I think a lot of our life is full of a lot of different, we could have gone down this path or the other path type turning points. And those moments of choice, those moments of change, or those moments of chance or destiny, or whatever we want to call it, are the things that help us navigate where we've come from and in turn decide where we're going.
Yeah. Do you think sometimes that the origin stories we create for ourselves can, I guess, limit ourselves or pigeonhole ourselves in some way? I mean, if you say, I grew up in a disadvantaged background, I was abused as a child, my family were all involved in drugs and crime, and that's who I am and that's my background, so that explains why I am the way I am. Can that story be, limiting in some ways and perhaps in a way that it doesn't have to be?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm a psychologist. I'm just speaking from, I guess, researching the article and my own experience. But absolutely, like if you are told a certain thing growing up, like, for example, I was always very academic in high school, and I was always told, you will be successful. You'll be able to do whatever you want. You could be a lawyer, or, any of these kind of things. And so choosing pastoral ministry for me to become a minister of a church was a difficult choice, because I'd been told from a very young age that there was certain roles that I should and could fulfill because of what they deemed my academic level.
Other people also help they directly input into what our origin story is. It's not just something we make up about ourselves.
Yeah. On the flip side of that, like you said, we could also, look at ourselves and say, well, I don't have these particular skills, or I've had these particular challenges, therefore I cannot achieve on that. But I think what the stories that we love to hear, the origin stories that we particularly love, is when someone has been limited by either their own perception of who they are or things, like you said, that others have told, and they've broken those boundaries and succeeded and said, just because someone's defined me that way or said that I can't achieve, I'm going to push past that and show that I can. And those are the stories that really we love and resonate with us, because they show the human spirit, and they give us hope that we do not have to be just who we've been told we are or who we perceive to be.
It's really interesting, isn't it? The amount of times that you hear someone sort of tell their life story and how often they remember this particular moment that for possibly everyone else around them was just another moment in an ordinary day. But, a teacher, for example, said to them, look, maybe you're not really a science person, you should probably switch subjects. And, and that sort of deflating experience, totally change the direction of their lives. I mean, possibly the response was, I'll show you, that's the other response, but possibly it's like, oh, it looks like I'm not that smart. Guess I won't go that way. Is it, you know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And so it's choosing, it's deciding who's going to make the decision. Am I going to decide for myself which way I'm going to go, or am I going to let other people influence me? So, and everyone responds to those external influences differently, which is, I suppose, why we see, different results in the world.
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, I guess there is an element of choice there, but sometimes we only sort of choose between the options that we're presented with, and that can be really tough sometimes. Now, Lindell, your article takes what for some readers might be a really strange, left turn from sort of going from this, like you say, quasi-psychology sort of beginning that your article starts with, because you then turn to the ancient creation myths of various cultures and religions. And look, again, I understand you're someone who's, just done some reading on this. I don't think you're an expert historian on this or anything, but you found it fascinating. Can you give us a little bit of a crash course on what you found there?
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. I am not a historian or anything, but it is absolutely fascinating. And the reason I looked at other creation myths and other religions is because I thought, let's put it into context. Let's see where we've come from in terms of what a lot of us believe, or, the beliefs that have emerged today. And what was really fascinating to me is, throughout ancient Greece, throughout ancient Egypt, the origin stories in these cultures are incredibly violent. They're incredibly these sort of sordid tales of debauchery and kind of really complicated relationships.
Incest and rape and all sorts of awful things, torture
all sorts of things. And then if they're not cutting up pieces of children or something and throwing them into the sea, it's like someone's running off with someone else, and these complicated marriage rituals, and a lot of it ends in death and decay, and that's how the earth emerges. And they're incredibly violent. And I just found that really fascinating that, a lot of our origin stories come from, no matter what culture you're in, it's this violent sort of eruption where humanity has come out of.
Yeah,
and to me, if you have this kind of violent, sordid tale of origins, if that's where you think that you come from, I think that's really going to affect how you relate to the world. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Implications for how we view ourselves.
Yeah. Look, I totally want to unpack that, but I think it sort of helps to maybe contrast some of what you've seen in those, those creation myths of various cultures and religions, to contrast and compare that with the biblical creation story. I mean, I imagine there must be a lot of similarities there, but it sounds like you're seeing that there are differences as well.
Yeah, and this is what really fascinated me, because if you go back to the biblical account, the origin story is vastly different. We have similar origin concepts in the sense that there's this kind of formless earth, this abyss. Everything sort of comes out of nothing, this abyss. We see that coming across. But, this idea of order and out of chaos, that sort of thing. But then in the biblical account, it's not creation that comes out of violence or revenge or retribution or retaliation, but it's creation and a world that's brought into being out of the desire of God to bring love into the world. It's not violence, jealousy, revenge, or sex or anything like that, but it's the creative work of what's described in the Bible as an intelligent, supernatural being that looks at something and desires to bring another party into it, to bring something to love, to create something beautiful and majestic and wonderful, rather than chaos and violence. And this is what really resonates with me in the creation account from the Bible.
Yeah.
That it's something completely different.
Yeah. I guess in those first two chapters of the book of Genesis, the very first book of the Bible, we see, God creating, the land and the sea and the animals and the plants and everything. And at each stage, he, the Bible says, and God saw that it was good. God saw that it was good. God saw that it was good. It's a repeated phrase, and then we have God, sort of giving, commands, but they're commands to do what comes naturally. These are the foods that you should eat. They're there for you to eat. Eat and enjoy. Go forth, be fruitful and multiply. So there's this sense of, hey, this is a good world. In fact, he says very good in some stages, and the task of all living things is simply to inhabit it, to enjoy it, to eat the food that's there, and to procreate. I mean, wow, Adam and Eve, naked in the garden making babies. I mean, it is quite a contrast, isn't it, to the, like you say, the warring titans and people being thrown into the abyss and chained in dungeons and et cetera, et cetera.
And you touched on a really important point there, that every element, the God of the Bible brings out this idea that it's good, and everything that is created has sense and purpose, and is put for a reason and is there to add. What's the word I'm looking for here? It's there to bring goodness and to add something into the world, rather than, in contrast to these ancient myths where it brings about terror and destruction, and that's how humanity comes about. Whereas what we see is God adding and adding and adding and creating something beautiful and wonderful out of what was nothing and what was formless. And then at the end of it, like you we have this day-by-day account, and then at the end of it, this incredibly powerful God, this being, the whole purpose of this creation is for him to stop at the end and spend time to enjoy it, which is so vastly different to what we've read in those other ancient accounts.
Yeah.
And so if origin stories are essentially where our purpose and place in the world comes out, then what we believe about where humanity comes from and the environment that we've come out of, and is really going to affect how humanity views itself down the track. Even as individuals, if we grow up believing that we've come from a nurturing, loving, caring home, then we're going to nurture, love, and care for ourselves. But if we grow up believing that we've come from a violent and challenging and unloving and really negative home, then we're going to have those similar feelings about ourselves, and it's going to be a constant struggle to try and rewrite that origin and the way that's impacted and reflected on us.
Yeah, I can hear what you're saying, Lindell, because you're saying also if we believe not just that we come from a loving and nurturing home, but we believe we come from a loving, nurturing God, that can have a real impact in our sense of self-concept, in our sense of destiny, and even in our sense of how we deal with our traumas.
Absolutely. But beyond that, it also changes the way that we deal with our fellow humanity and our fellow humankind, because not only if we come from an origin where there's violence and stress and negativity and trauma, then we have these assumptions that each person that we come in contact with could essentially have a similar experience. But if we believe that all of humanity comes from this place of love and care and intention and the love of a good and just and true God, then when we look at other human beings and we look at the rest of humanity, we go, well, they've come from this same origin story, therefore they deserve the respect and love and treatment that I would give to myself. And so it changes our view on humankind, and beyond that, it changes our view on the created world. It changes our view on creation and the environment and our obligation to protect and nurture it, rather than strive against it and overcome it.
Yeah. So Lindell, I guess the elephant in the room, or maybe I should say that the mammoth in the room, is that the most mainstream creation myth that we have in the West is the Big Bang, evolution. I guess we could call it naturalism or materialism. The belief that life, the universe, and everything came about by random, unguided natural forces. So, what are the implications for our psyche, for our self-concept, if we accept this as our origin story?
Again, it's going to be different for every individual, but I think there's something to be said from the idea of, was there purpose in the creation of our world, or was there just random chance?
Am I here for a reason? Yeah.
Yeah, and we look at the world at the moment and we go, wow, with the state that it's in, can there be any real purpose? But this is where we can't take the story of the biblical creation account. We need to sort of take a step back and zoom out and see it in the broader biblical story of this idea of God creating something beautiful and wonderful with the intention of a peaceful, cohesive, and perfect unified world. And then obviously in the broader biblical story, sin enters the world and we see chaos and result, and then we have the salvation story of Jesus coming and ultimately, I'm taking big sweeping steps.
Yeah. Very broad brush strokes, yeah.
Yeah, we have Jesus enter the world and the salvation of the earth, and then we see this hope in recreation. And you see, if we step out broader and look at the broader biblical story, there is purpose amidst the pain and the challenges that we face in this world. Whereas I think, from a natural, you mentioned naturalist or materialist, or, an evolutionary type of worldview, this is something that we can't find answers to those questions with that type of worldview. If everything sort of came from, and again, I'm no expert on these subjects, especially around evolution. I don't have the expertise, but if essentially the origins of our world and humanity is random and unintentional and just sort of came about, then what's the overall purpose for the earth? What are we striving for? Where are we headed? And these sort of questions that don't really help us make sense of the world, but rather raise more questions than give answers, can leave us feeling sort of deflated and frustrated and sort of wondering, well, where is my place? And as we said at the very beginning, origin stories really help us to answer our place in the world.
Yeah.
Yet this idea of random beginnings doesn't really help answer that at all. And so it ends up kind of leaving us feeling just a bit more lost than maybe before.
Yeah. I guess though, Lindell, some who are listening might be thinking, well, that may be the case, that, believing in a loving creator God, makes you feel better about yourself and about the direction of your life. But what if you're just deceiving yourself in order to get warm fuzzies? Maybe it should be the case, harden up, princess, face reality. We came from nothing. We're going to nothing. There's only oblivion to look forward to. You have to figure out a way to sort that out. I mean, there are people who say that, and they're serious about it, and they have found ways around it. So, I mean, you've been very humble today about your level of expertise, but, you're clearly an intelligent person. So how is it that, I assume you're not just deliberately deceiving yourself in believing in a creator God? You must have some sort of rational basis to believe that, believing in a biblical creation or a sense of a loving creator God actually makes rational sense. I mean, obviously, we don't have time for you to, give a blow by blow, but do you have any sort of, rational basis for believing this, or is it just about feeling good?
Well, look, I don't think it's just about feeling good. I think the reality is that humanity does want to make sense of the world, and that's why we come up with all different sort of theories. And that's the thing, they are theories because I can't give you evidence for the creation account. I can't give you, other than what's put in scripture, but if that's not something that's meaningful to you, then that's not evidence. Do you understand what I'm saying? I can quote Bible verses, but if that has no meaning in your life, then that's not really going to cut it. In the same way with other theories of our origins, with evolution, with naturalism, all this sort of stuff, we can't conclusively say this either. I know we've got different dating methods and things like that, and I know scientists debate back and forth, and that is definitely not my sphere, so I'm not going to enter that that area. If I could just speak personally, for me, the creation account does give me sense and meaning and purpose, but each origin story does require an element of faith, and I can only speak to the faith that I've experienced in my life, but I've witnessed and experienced what it means to have a personal relationship with a God who I believe created the earth, and I've seen evidence of this God work and change people's lives. With my work as a pastor, this is what I work in, this is what I do. And so, it does require faith. It doesn't always make us feel good, though, because the reality is just because you believe a certain way doesn't mean that your life is going to all of a sudden click and make sense, that everything's going to be wonderful.
You've got to deal with things like guilt and sin then, don't you? And that's not always positive.
Exactly. But for me, it's a personal faith in Jesus and knowing that regardless of what happens in this world, the challenges that we face, the pandemics, the crisis, the war, that there is, the psychologist talked about this idea of destiny or sheer chance, but I don't see it that way. I see it that with the creation story, we have a creator that intimately knows about our lives, that created our world out of love and desire to see reconciliation between us and the world. And though, from the Bible account, what I believe is that the entrance of sin in the world destroyed that, we have a hope. And she speaks about destiny, but for me, that destiny is a God-given destiny. And I've experienced it in my life, and I've seen it in other people's lives. So unfortunately, Ken, I can't give you concrete evidence, but that's just the way our origin stories work.
Yeah, you have given some evidence because clearly, this works. When you see, as you say, you've seen your life changed, you've seen other people's lives transformed, that is evidence. Surely that's evidence that something is going on, that something is, worthy of some serious investigation. Wow, look, we've gone through some really interesting theories and themes today, all the way from the cinema and Marvel origin stories through, all kinds of ancient myths and the darkness of psychology, all the way through to a loving creator God. But look, I really enjoyed reading your article and helping sort of edit it as we put it together, Lindell, and I've really appreciated chatting with you today. Thanks so much for being a part of Signs of the Times Radio.
Well, thank you so much, Ken. It's been a great chat this morning, and I'm glad that you've had me on.
Today's episode was based on an article appearing in this month's Signs of the Times magazine. A subscription is just $26 for 11 issues a year. To find out more, visit signsofthetimes.org.au. Signs of the Times has been published in Australia since 1886 and is proudly produced by Adventist Media.
This is an Adventist Media podcast.